Now, 24 millimeters is always interesting because out of all of the common prime lens focal lengths, 24 millimeters is one of the most different on aps-c versus full frame. And what I mean by that is, the sort of situations you'd use it in can actually be very, very different. On a full 35 millimeter camera, 24 millimeters is a very, very wide angle that's often used for things like landscapes or architecture or something like that. But if you're using it on aps-c, then it's more of a standard angle. It actually comes out to be about 38 millimeters, which is more general purpose. Now the thing is, with this Canon 24mm EF-S STM lens, it only works on aps-c. So that whole wide angle aspect is basically non-existent on this lens. So you really should be coming into this video with the mindset of, say, a 35 or 40mm prime lens, because effectively that's what this lens is. Now, granted, this is a lens that's been reviewed many, many times. It's not an obscure lens by any stretch of the imagination. But there are definitely a few observations I've made that I haven't really seen anyone else bring up in any of their videos. So hopefully you can find some value in this review. Now, one of the standout features of this 24mm prime, of course, is how ridiculously small it is. And let's just put into perspective how small it actually is. Now here I'm going to grab a lens that at one point was basically one of the smallest that Canon has sold in a very long time. So here is the 50mm f1.8 Mark II, which at one point was about as small as it got in many years. And as you see, it pretty much dwarfs a 24mm prime. And like I said, this is not a big lens. This is a teeny lens. So again, that's how small this is. Or, again, to put it into perspective again, here is a off-brand gluten-free Oreo. And, I mean, this is closer in size to an Oreo than most other camera equipment. I mean, this is absolutely teeny, which is both a blessing and a curse. Obviously, it's good because it doesn't really add any weight whatsoever to your camera. But something else that people really fail to mention in any of their videos is it can give you a very good level of discretion and, stealthiness. Because when you put this on smaller camera bodies, say something like one of Canon's Rebel cameras, then it doesn't really look like a full DSLR anymore. At that point, your whole camera rig will start to look more like one of Canon's larger point-and-shoot cameras. And that could be good because if you're doing street photography, and like I pointed out, this is a great general purpose lens, so this is a wonderful focal length for street photography. So if you're doing that, people might not even realize you're a serious photographer. They could just think you're, just some other guy with their point and shoot taking, tourist pictures. So, having such a small camera rig, such a small, no accessories, just a body and the small lens, you can get some very, very interesting discrete pictures with this, which is definitely a good thing. Because like I said, if you're carrying around a big L lens and L zoom lens, which can go down to 24mm or something like that, there's no discretion with that. Everyone will see you using that. So if you're looking to get very, very candid street photography pictures or something like that, this could help. But of course, there is a flip side to this. What if you want people to know that you're, taking actually serious pictures? Unfortunately, photography is a business where, a lot of the clients just assume that whoever has the biggest camera will take the best pictures. Obviously, they just don't know any better. They might see the other guy with a big L zoom lens, and they might just go to him for their pictures. And like I said, in a business where you have to show off your gear by having the biggest, craziest, flashy gear, even if it's not necessarily required to take better pictures, having such a small setup could actually turn people off to you. So again, it's a blessing and a curse. Now something else I'd like to point out, which is a major positive, is look at the front element of the lens here. It's teeny. Now one of the good things about that is it's extremely hard to hit. I mean, if you look at the whole front of the lens, there's more plastic than there is glass. So, if you have the lens cap off and you were to accidentally touch it, you're more likely to hit the plastic, which makes this probably the most protected SLR lens I know when it comes to its front element. So, for people like me that hate using filters and will avoid using filters at all costs, this is very good. Now, granted, I could still use a lens hood, and I often do, but out of all the lenses I have, it's one of the least necessary because it's very well protected. Now, just talking about the actual build quality overall, this does have the nice metal lens mount, which is very good for such an extremely cheap lens. But aside from that, it is the standard plastic style construction, and it's perfectly fine for its extremely cheap price. In fact, I'd say it exceeds expectations, if anything. Now, this lens definitely has some interesting features regarding its focusing. Now, it does have Canon's STM autofocus motor. And unfortunately, the autofocusing is not ridiculously fast. There's definitely lenses that focus a lot faster, but it is very, very silent. And like I said, for the sort of street photography or things you might want to do with this lens, that's definitely a major positive. Now when it comes to manually focusing, this lens is very interesting. You actually have to have it attached to a camera that's powered on to be able to manually focus. Now that's not necessarily a major downside, but let's say your camera's running low on batteries and you just want to look through the viewfinder and, maybe compose your picture without turning on the camera. And unfortunately, you can't do this on this lens, but again, not a major downside, but something that could come up at one point. This lens does not have full-time manual focus, so if you set it to autofocus, and you turn the manual focus ring, it won't manually focus the lens, but it won't do anything either. It's not like it's going to damage the lens like it would on some of Canon's older lenses. So for focusing, this lens definitely gets a major pass. Not bad whatsoever. Now, when it comes to the image quality of this lens, it's pretty good. It's honestly, at least on my copy of the lens, not nearly as good as people seem to be claiming it is to be. Now, generally what I find, having used this lens quite a few times now, is that sharpness is basically just as good in the center at basically every aperture of the lens. You have good sharpness in the center, never really great, but at least good, starting all the way open at f2.8. Now, granted, as you stop down, the corners will get sharper, but I find that you never really get any great sharpness at any aperture. Now, it's never bad, it's always good enough, but it's really never all that great. Now again, for comparison, I find that Canon's, one of their 50mm primes really blows this 24mm out of the water. Now if you compare both of them at f2.8, the 50mm will be a lot sharper. And I didn't expect this. I thought this would put up a pretty fair fight against the 50mm. Now it could be that my particular lens is a softer copy. And don't get me wrong, it's not a soft lens by any means. It never really gets soft at any of the common apertures you'd use. But again, if you compare it to this particular prime lens or something like this, it really doesn't have the same resolve power. So for the vast majority of the time, the 24mm has more than good enough image quality. The only times I'd say you're going to find issues with it is if you're making very large prints or going to be cropping in heavily, which again are very situational. For the majority of the time, this will give you very good image quality that's going to be perfectly usable. Now there are some chromatic aberrations some of the time. It, again, never really gets that bad, but they're definitely there, so keep that in mind. But like I said, image quality is definitely not a major issue with this lens whatsoever. It's very usable. Now, one of my favorite features, if not my absolute favorite feature of the Canon 24mm pancake lens is its incredible close minimum focus distance. Now, don't get me wrong, this is not a macro lens. It can't give you that one-to-one you'd need for it to be considered a full macro lens, but out of all the lenses I've ever used, not including specialty lenses or macro lenses like that, this is the closest minimum focus distance of any of them. Now, Canon's 24mm pancake lens can focus all the way down to 16 centimeters. Now, that's very close, a lot closer than put into perspective how close that is. Let's do a little comparison. So here we have Canon's 50mm f1.8 lens, which could focus down to 45 centimeters, which is about average, pretty good for a standard lens. Here's a lens that could focus about a foot away. The other pancake lens, the 40mm prime, which is about 30 centimeters. Here we have Canon's 18-55 kit lens, which focuses down to 25 centimeters, which is really close. And finally, here's the 24mm prime, which focuses all the way down to 16 centimeters. Like I said, very close. Now, I have the Canon 24mm pancake lens attached to the camera. Let's try to illustrate how close you can really get. So I'm going to focus in all the way here. Now let's start moving in towards the plant. And look at that. Look how close you can get. The depth of field is basically gone. So this is a great opportunity for shallow depth of field, some really creative pictures. Maybe not something you'll use all the time, but a very nice feature. So again, you can focus very closely. So overall, would I recommend the Canon EF-S 24mm f2.8 STM pancake lens? Well, if it's the first prime lens you're ever going to buy, I might still steer you in the direction of 50mm f1.8. For a lens that's really not more expensive whatsoever, you're getting a lens with better image quality and a wider maximum aperture. Now don't get me wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong with this lens and I wouldn't tell anyone to avoid it, but I'd say it's not necessarily as very generally useful. I'd say this is more for people like me who had initially invested more money into telephoto and, kind of telephoto and standard glass, and we're looking for something on the wider angle that'll have usable image quality. If that's what you're looking for, this lens will definitely do. If you're looking for a cheap lens that will be pretty past split video, this will definitely do too. Obviously, this has a pretty major advantage over the 50mm f1.8 as video. you know, this is definitely a much more usable focal length for most video recording. Now, granted, it doesn't have image stabilization, but also I think for such a relatively wide angle, I don't think that's a huge deal. But with all that said, I definitely recommend this lens if it's what you're looking for. It definitely will do the job in most subjects, and thank you very much for watching.